Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something pretty specific, a really interesting, maybe unconventional idea. It tackles a tough one, those deep, buried, heavily protected underground facilities. How do you actually deal with them?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge strategically and technically.
So the material we're looking at today, it's mainly based on excerpts from a presentation. It's titled Plug Up Iranian Nukes. And there's also a short resume provided. Both are linked to a Dr. Lev Neymotin.
And the material identifies him as the originator of this specific suggestion we're discussing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our mission here really is to pull out the key insights from these documents for you. We want to look at, who Dr. Neymotin is based on the info we have here, then get into his unique suggestion for handling these buried sites.
How he actually proposed dealing with them and how he shared it.
Right. And then this is kind of the crux of it. There's a reported event later on that the presentation connects directly back to his idea. So we'll unpack that connection as the source itself presents it.
Okay, sounds good. So maybe start with Dr. Neymotin himself, based on that resume.
Yeah, let's do that. Who is the person behind this idea, according to the documents?
Well, the resume points to a really solid technical foundation. It's quite deep. His academic path started pretty early. He got a BS in physics, then an MS in mechanical engineering, finishing those by 1967.
Okay.
And then he went on for a PhD, also mechanical engineering, from Kazakh State University. That was between 71 and 74.
So decades of focus there. Physics and mechanical engineering, that's a powerful combo for this kind of field.
Definitely. And then professionally, the resume highlights a long stint at Brookhaven National Laboratory. Almost 2 decades, actually.
Brookhaven, right. That's a major U.S. lab.
Yeah, from 1997 to 2015. And crucially, he was in their nonproliferation and national security department.
Ah, okay. So right in the thick of things related to, well, nonproliferation.
Exactly. His work there was part of the U.S. Department of Energy's NNSA program, that's the National Nuclear Security Administration, specifically focused on international nuclear materials, physical protection, and accountability.
That sounds very relevant.
It gets more specific. The resume mentions he was involved in implementing MC&A upgrades.
MC&A.
Materials control and accounting. Implementing upgrades for this at Russian nuclear weapons facilities.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack that a bit.
Right.
MC&A. What does that really mean in practice, and why would that experience be, potentially key here?
So MC&A, it's basically the bookkeeping for nuclear materials, but like super high-stakes bookkeeping. It's about knowing precisely what material you have, exactly where it is, how much, and making absolutely sure none of it has walked off or been diverted.
Right, tracking every gram.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And working on upgrades to these systems, especially at actual nuclear weapons facilities in Russia, that gives you incredible insight. You're not just looking at diagrams or theories. You're dealing with the real-world, messy, operational stuff.
Like how things actually work on the ground.
Exactly. How materials are physically moved, how they're stored, what kind of access controls work and don't work, the security systems, the cameras, the seals, and, critically, all the infrastructure needed to make that facility function.
Infrastructure meaning? Like power, ventilation, data lines.
All of it. You get this intimate feel for the place as a living system, not just a big concrete box buried underground.
So it's like understanding the plumbing, the electrical grid, the access tunnels, the procedures, all the things that are essential for it to do whatever it's designed to do, beyond just surviving a hit.
Precisely. You start to see the operational lifelines, and maybe the vulnerabilities that aren't obvious if you're just thinking about brute force against the outer shell.
That makes sense.
And the resume also mentions a broad range of publications, things like thermal hydraulics, reactor safety, risk assessment, and a lot on nuclear materials control and accounting. It paints a picture of a career just steeped in the technical nuts and bolts and the security side of nuclear tech and materials.
Okay, that's a helpful background. So, keeping that practical operational perspective in mind, let's turn to the core idea in that presentation. Plug up Iranian nukes. The problem it's tackling is, as we said, a big one. How do you neutralize these incredibly hardened, deeply buried facilities built, deep inside mountains or way underground?
Yeah, places designed specifically to withstand massive conventional attacks. The usual thinking is you need bigger and bigger bombs, right? Things that can penetrate deeper and deeper.
The earth-penetrating munitions, the bunker busters.
Right. But Dr. Neymotin's idea, which the presentation says he first put out publicly on X, formerly Twitter, back on October 10th, 2024, it takes a completely different approach.
Okay.
He suggested basically that you might not need those super expensive, potentially politically tricky, Earth-penetrating weapons to go after the core facility itself.
So what's the alternative then?
The alternative, he proposed, according to the source, is using conventional precision-guided bombs, things that are more common, easier to use perhaps. But instead of aiming for the buried chamber, you aim for its external support systems, its lifelines.
Lifelines. So not the heavily reinforced core structure, but things on the outside or leading to it.
Exactly that. The presentation highlights his focus on hitting the electricity access points, cutting the power, and then following up by disabling and constantly monitoring the entry points, the tunnels, the shafts.
Okay, so choke it off, essentially.
That seems to be the concept presented. It raises a really interesting point for you, the listener, to think about. If the goal is stopping the facility's function, does disabling it by cutting its power and access achieve the same end as, trying to physically destroy the core, maybe more easily?
It's a different way of thinking about neutralizing.
Definitely. Disabling versus annihilation.
And the presentation points out that in his original public appeal, he mentioned U.S. Earth-penetrating weapons, and the necessary approvals were, quote, not required, although welcome.
Which implies, or suggests at least, that the method could potentially be carried out using more readily available means, less reliant on highly specialized, top-tier military assets.
And the presentation quotes his direct call to action from that October 2024 post on X. It was very direct.
What did it say?
Quote, IDF, duct plug up Iran's nukes. Just like that. Using that specific term, plug up.
Plug up, like sealing it off, which fits that idea of targeting access and lifelines.
Exactly. Now, this is where the presentation draws a connection that it presents as, well, pretty striking. As we said, Dr. Neymotin, the originator here, made that public post with his suggestion on X on October 10th, 2024.
Okay, got the date.
The presentation then explicitly flags a reported event that happened 12 months and 2 days later.
12 months and 2 days, so October 12, 2025.
Correct, according to the timeline given in the source material.
And what does the presentation say happened on that date?
It states, quote, the skies above Iran reportedly lit up with coordinated strikes targeting deep underground nuclear infrastructure.
Right. So strikes happen, reportedly targeting those kinds of facilities, but how are they described? Do they flatten everything?
That's the key point the presentation makes. It says initial analysis based on satellite images and local reports cited in the source pointed, quote, not to flatten buildings, but rather to pinpoint a destruction of surrounding infrastructure, particularly entry tunnels, access points, and utility corridors. And it adds, power was cut. Surface structures, curiously, were left largely intact.
Okay, wait. Target and entry tunnels, access points, utility corridors, cutting power, leaving surface buildings mostly alone.
Sounds familiar, right?
It sounds exactly like the specific method Neymotin suggested a year earlier, targeting the lifelines, not the main structure.
That is precisely the parallel the presentation draws.
Yeah.
It argues the way these reported actions were carried out aligns very, very closely. It uses the phrase to the letter with the specific unconventional tactic Dr. Neymotin had publicly advocated.
Wow, okay.
The presentation even uses an analogy to drive the point home.
What's the analogy?
It says, it's almost as if the IDF understood that the most effective way to kill a buried organism is to suffocate it, not to smash its ribcage.
Suffocate it by cutting off the lifelines. Power, access. Okay, that's a vivid way to put it.
It is. Now, importantly, the presentation itself does pose the question. Coincidence? Maybe. It acknowledges that possibility.
Right, it has to.
But then it follows up immediately by stating, referring to the reported actions, they followed up on my appeal to the letter, and very effectively.
So the originator, Dr. Neymotin, in this presentation is claiming a direct connection, or at minimum, a precise alignment between his public suggestion and the reported events.
That's what the source material we have asserts. Again, we're relaying the claims and the narrative presented in these documents. It makes a very clear case for this link.
Understood. So stepping back from the specific tactics and the claimed connection, what does the presentation suggest about the strategic message of an action like this, if it happened the way described?
Good question. The presentation argues that, quote, whether intended or not, hitting these facilities in this particular way sent a much deeper message.
A message to whom? Just Iran.
According to the source, not just Iran, it suggests the message was really aimed at, quote, every aspiring nuclear state on the economic periphery.
Okay, on the economic periphery. Why that specific group? What's the thinking there, according to the source?
The implied logic seems to be that countries with fewer resources, They might be able to dig a deep hole and bury something sensitive. They might achieve that initial hardening.
Right, the core structure might be tough.
But building truly redundant, hardened support infrastructure, multiple independent power sources far from the site, deeply buried and protected access tunnels miles long, hardened ventilation systems, robust, secure comms that takes enormous resources that states on the periphery, maybe under sanctions, might struggle to muster.
So their lifelines might be more exposed, more vulnerable, even if the core is buried deep.
That seems to be the vulnerability this approach targets, according to the presentation. Their external connections might be easier to find and hit with precision conventional weapons than the deep core itself.
Okay, so what is the message then, as the presentation frames it?
It's pretty blunt in the source material. Quote, "If you bury your nukes underground, we'll bury them with you."
Wow. Not destroy them, but entomb them. Cut them off. Make them inaccessible.
That's the implication, redefining the threat from, massive airstrikes and destruction to something more like strategic entombment.
And the presentation calls this a surgical sealing operation.
Yes. It describes the potential approach as high-tech, possibly bloodless, or at least lower casualty than a direct assault, and, importantly, strategically irreversible.
Irreversible. Why irreversible? Because it's just too hard to dig it out again if the power's cut and the tunnels are collapsed and watched.
That appears to be the argument. If entry points are sealed, power is cut indefinitely, and maybe there's ongoing monitoring, trying to regain access or make the facility functional again would be incredibly difficult, slow, expensive, and potentially dangerous for the state trying to do it.
So it effectively takes the facility offline for the long term without needing a massive bombing campaign or, finding and hitting the exact core chamber.
That's the strategic shift the presentation seems to highlight. Moving from overwhelming kinetic force to a more precise, almost systemic method of incapacitation by targeting those crucial external links.
It really leverages that deep understanding of how these complex systems actually work and stay alive, focusing on the operational weak points, not just the physical defenses.
Which brings us back full circle, doesn't it, to Dr. Neymotin's background. We talked about his decades of work, especially with MC&A, inside nuclear facilities. How does that specific experience likely feed into this kind of unconventional idea?
Well, it gives him exactly that unique perspective we discussed earlier. If you've spent years wrestling with the practicalities of tracking materials, securing access, planning maintenance, dealing with power requirements, waste removal, you see the facility differently.
Not just as a fortress.
Not just as a fortress.
Yeah.
You see it as an intricate, interdependent system. You understand intimately that even the most hardened vault needs mundane things like reliable electricity, air to breathe, ways for people and equipment to get in and out safely.
Things that might seem secondary if you're only thinking about bomb resistance.
Exactly. And his background in nuclear safety analysis probably plays in too. Understanding failure modes, what happens if power is lost, what happens if ventilation fails, what if access is blocked for an extended period.
Right. He might have analyzed scenarios where disrupting those lifelines could render a facility useless or even dangerous, totally separate from physical damage to the core.
It's that granular, operational, systems-level knowledge that could lead someone to identify these perhaps less obvious, but absolutely critical vulnerabilities as the real strategic targets, the lifelines.
It's like because he understood the facility's internal nervous system and circulatory system so well from his hands-on work. He could see the logic in cutting those off, rather than just trying to smash the skeleton.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's shifting from seeing it as a purely structural problem to seeing it as an operational systems problem. And that kind of perspective shift often unlocks completely different kinds of solutions.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive unpacking the material you brought us.
Yeah.
We've learned a bit about Dr. Lev Neymotin, the originator of this presentation, and his really deep background in nuclear security and materials control. Decades of it.
Yeah, real hands-on experience.
And we explored his very specific, quite unconventional suggestion for how you might disable a deeply buried nuclear facility, not by trying to obliterate the core, but by targeting its lifelines, the power, the access points, maybe even with more conventional weapons.
And we looked at how the presentation says he put that idea out publicly on X in October 2024. And then, crucially, how the presentation itself draws that direct line between his specific suggestion and a reported military action about a year later, in October 2025, targeting Iranian nuclear sites, an action which, according to this source, mirrored his suggested methodology very closely.
Targeting those access points and utilities, yeah.
Yeah.
We also touched on the potential strategic message that the presentation argues such an action could send. A new way, maybe, to counter buried proliferation threats, especially for states without vast resources for redundant infrastructure.
So this deep dive into the source material really leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. In this world, with all these complex security threats like nuclear proliferation, how can highly specialized, maybe even niche, technical or operational expertise, how might that intersect with real-world events when it's shared publicly? Does really understanding the nitty-gritty details of how something complex works like a nuclear facility reveal unconventional ways to deal with big problems? Ways that maybe get missed if you only focus on the most obvious brute force approaches.
Something to definitely think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some interesting perspectives based on the material we examined today.